November the 3rd, 1957 fell on a Sunday. In the United States, people were talking about a UFO that had been seen in Texas the day before. In Stockholm, future actor Dolph Lundgren was busy being born, while in the Soviet Union, another major first was about to happen. Having worked on a large and complex satellite whose launch was postponed in favor of the much simpler Sputnik 1, it was now time to finally put the bigger one to use. That Sunday would mark the day when the first animal ever would be sent to orbit our planet. And sadly, it would also mark the day of its death. This is the story of Laika the dog, and also of some other dogs. My name is Alex Teva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. By 1957, people had already been trying to throw animals upwards as high as they could for hundreds of years, but they only started using rockets at the end of World War II, when the Americans sent a bunch of fruit flies on top of a V-2 rocket. The fruit flies survived. A whole lot of other living organisms were experimented with, such as monkeys or mice. A lot, if not most of these creatures found their usually terrifying deaths in these experiments. Sending dogs to space was a Soviet idea based on the observation that humans had a lot more in common with dogs than with, say, fruit flies. The experts decided that most appropriate for these experiments would be mongrel female dogs. Oleg Gazenko, one of the scientists in charge of finding the dogs, explains. There was in Moscow a special organization that caught street dogs, where it was possible to select them. We took care of them and gradually accustomed them to the conditions of the space experiment. The dogs had to be female in order to address the problem of urination in a cramped space, and they had to be mongrels because they were assumed to be tougher and more resilient. They would also need to weigh less than 6 kilograms, be small enough to fit in the space box, and have light-colored fur so that they would be easier to see by the TV cameras. A number of dogs that fit this profile was therefore requested from the dog catchers, who were taken by surprise by the large number of requirements. One of the dog catchers complained, "Would you like them to also have blue eyes and howl in C major?" But dogs were found and trained by professional dog trainers and conditioned in simulations that used the same cramped box in which they would eventually be launched. These experiments took place at the time when Korolyov's engineers still used the R-1 rocket. In order to send dogs in it, they changed the flight profile of the rocket. It would fly to a height of just over 100 kilometers, then let go of its special capsule containing 2 dogs, which would then follow its own freefall trajectory, and was otherwise completely uncontrolled. After falling for about 30 kilometers, the dog on the right side of the capsule was ejected in a small spacesuit and under a parachute. The dog on the left side was ejected about 40 kilometers later. Their suits, if you could call them that, didn't have masks. Instead, they were like a box containing its own oxygen supply, and with a transparent bubble around the dog's head. The capsule also contained a film camera, which was able to film 5 or 6 minutes so the scientists could observe the dog's reactions. The first of these rocket dogs were Tigan and Desek, which the Soviet Union sent up and importantly also recovered. They went into space, but not into orbit. This happened in July 1951. They flew at 4,200 kilometers an hour at 101 kilometers altitude, and even experienced 4 minutes of weightlessness. Then they plunged back into the atmosphere, fell freely for most of the way, and under a parachute for the last 6 kilometers. Both dogs survived the flight, even though Tigan got a small injury on her belly on impact with the ground. Thus, Tigan and Desek became the first living higher organisms to be successfully recovered from a spaceflight. This was kind of a long name for a first, but it was a first nonetheless. It took the Americans some months before they were able to replicate it. We don't know for sure exactly how many dogs the Soviets had launched on rockets. Probably around 60 or more. Some dogs flew more than once. Almost all of those who died did so because of technical failures, but one didn't. Laika was actually expected to die in orbit. Of course, even that didn't go as planned, and the poor thing died of stress and overheating a whole lot earlier than expected. But this was a state secret for 45 years. It was only in 2002 that the Soviets finally admitted to it. But before Laika, there were others. Desek, one of those first 2 dogs who flew in 1951, but not high and fast enough to reach an orbit, flew again later that year, together with another dog whose name was Lisa, which in Russian means fox. They died because their parachute didn't open on account of a pressure sensor that had been damaged by vibrations. Another dog named Lisa, imaginatively codenamed Lisa 2, flew with a dog called Ryzik, meaning ginger, to the same altitude of 100 kilometers in June 1954. The third launch was nearly cancelled when Smilaya, which means brave in Russian, bravely ran away from the rocket, causing everyone to fear that she had been eaten by the jackals. As it happened, though, she returned by her own will, and flew together with another dog named Malishka, which means baby. Later that autumn it happened again. Bobik the dog ran away but didn't return, so a suitable replacement was quickly found around the canteen. Again with characteristic imagination, she was named Zib, which was actually an acronym for Zamena Iskieznuvshemu Babiku, meaning substitute for missing Bobik. Together with another dog, Zib made a successful flight to an altitude of 100 kilometers and was recovered. In 1957, the Soviets famously put the first man-made object into orbit, but the success of Sputnik 1 came at a price for Korolev. Encouraged by that fantastic propagandistic success, Nikita Khrushchev called Korolev to the Kremlin and first congratulated him for launching the satellite before the Americans, and then casually asked him to launch something else interesting in time for the 40th anniversary of the Great Revolution, which was in a month. And so it was time for another major world first, sending the first animal to Earth orbit. Sputnik 2 logically succeeded Sputnik 1. Logically, that is, until we remember that the first satellite that the Soviets built actually became Sputnik 3, because it had gotten far too complex and risky to be launched in time to be the first in the world. In any case, Sputnik 2 was built to carry a dog into orbit. It was a 4-meter tall metal cone with a base diameter of 2 meters. At around half a ton, it was more than 6 times the weight of Sputnik 1. Inside it, in fact, there was a duplicate of Sputnik 1, plus a container in which the Soviets saw fit to put a dog. Most people have heard about Laika the dog. Stamp collectors probably own the 1957 editions with Laika and Sputnik 2 pictured on the stamps. Like the other space dogs, Laika had to go through some small surgeries in preparation for the flight in order to have some sensors fitted. and in the morning of November the 3rd, 1957, she took off on top of an R-7 rocket from the launch pad at Tyuratam. But the rocket booster never separated from her spaceship, which meant that the temperature control system malfunctioned, heating the poor dog up to over 40 degrees. Her physiological data stopped coming after about 5 or 6 hours of flight, and soon Laika died of overheating and stress. Of course, that never had been a rescue plan for her. She would have died anyway, to the eternal dismal of animal protection organizations everywhere. But as I've mentioned in the introduction of the episode, the Soviets lied that she had died the rather more peaceful death of oxygen asphyxiation, and stuck with that lie until 2002. The significance of this flight is easy to understate because after all it was only a dog. But think about it. Life on Earth began about 4 billion years ago. Every being on Earth that ever lived in the past 4 billion years and never left the atmosphere of this planet. But try to imagine the Earth from orbit with its atmosphere as a thin blanket that covers it. Then realize that only the tiniest fraction of that thin atmosphere held everything that ever lived on Earth. Until November the 3rd, 1957, everything that ever lived had lived on Earth until that day. Then Laika flew and changed something that had been unchanged for 4 billion years. It usually helps to put things into perspective, but sometimes the perspective is just too much to encompass. Anyway, returning to dogs, between 1959 and 1960, a dog named Otvarzhnaya flew no fewer than 5 times. 3 other dogs whose names we know also flew. They were Snezhinka, meaning snowflake, Albina, meaning bee, and Tsiganka, meaning gypsy girl. When the Soviets launched their manned space program, which was called Vostok, meaning east, they obviously began it with animal experiments. The first Vostok launch was a simple spacecraft which was never intended to be recovered. But in 1960, the second Vostok launch was prepared, and this one contained 2 dogs. Their names were Chaika, meaning seagull, and Lisichka, which means little fox. The launch took place on July 28, 1960, and it went badly from the start. 19 seconds after takeoff, there was a fire in a combustion chamber which caused a series of cascading failures until 9.5 seconds later, the entire booster exploded, killing both dogs. In the winter of the same year, another launch aimed to put 2 other dogs in orbit. It was usual for the space dogs to have several names, and the ones you've heard so far are probably the most used ones for the dogs in question. But these 2 dogs really went through an identity crisis. One of them was called Damka, also known as Shutka, also known as Zemchuzhnaya, and sometimes simply as Alpha. The other was called Krasavska, but also Kamietka or Zhulka. Apparently naming space dogs was more difficult than sending them to orbit. Not that that was easy. The upper stage of the rocket failed, then the ejection system failed, then the self-destruct mechanism failed. The animals fell back to Earth under a parachute, ending up in deep snow in the middle of Siberia. This self-destruct mechanism is worth speaking more about because it was a true testament to what the Soviets were all about. The decision had been taken at the highest level that all the Vostok ships should have a bomb on board. This bomb was known by the acronym APO, coming from Avarny Padriev Objekta, literally meaning emergency object destruction. You don't need much imagination to guess what it did, if the spacecraft ever became a danger to anyone on the ground, but much more importantly, if it ever was in danger of landing outside the borders of the Soviet Union. The engineers were under strict orders to blow it up. and the mission would simply be swept under the rug as if it never existed. No press release would be issued, no explanations would be given, and anyone even mentioning it would be harshly punished. It was a bomb that destroyed the spacecraft and everything in it in order to preserve the careers of those on the ground. Almost as soon as it was installed, it was used. During the fourth Vostok flight, a problem emerged with the braking engine, which meant that the spacecraft would land outside the Union. It could not be allowed to fall into foreign hands. A sensor on board the spacecraft took note of the fact that it was leaving Soviet territory. A circuit was closed and the whole thing blew up, including the 2 dogs on board, Mushka and Pchelka. Their names meant Little Fly and Little Bee. On this flight, however, with the 2 dogs of 1,000 names, the bomb didn't go off in space as it was supposed to, and it landed together with a capsule in a huge snowy forest in the middle of the Siberian winter. As a fail-safe trigger, the bomb had been programmed to explode 60 hours after landing. The Soviets then needed to find this capsule before it blew up with all its space research and whatever else was nearby. A team was put together, led by an experienced space engineer called Arvid Pallo. This was a man who had worked with explosives since before the war, so he knew a thing or two about what he was getting into. As soon as the first scout plane found the spacecraft by its radio beacon, he jumped into a helicopter, together with the guy who had designed the bomb and with a KGB agent. When they arrived at the site, as far as the eye could see, there were nothing but trees. Pallo asked the helicopter pilot to land in the nearest clearing, which by itself was no easy feat, and then they started through the woods and the snow and got lost after 60 meters. Pallo asked the plane pilot, whose plane was already low on fuel, to show them the direction to the capsule before departing. Eventually they found it, and to their amazement, the compartments with the dogs were still inside the capsule. He could see them through the porthole, but because it was covered in frost, he couldn't see the actual dogs. Not only was it getting dark soon, but the 60 hours were nearly up, and the bomb explosion became more and more of a probability. Anatoly Komarov, the bomb designer, got to work and managed to disarm it in time, but light was fading. The helicopter pilot needed to take off while they still had light, meaning that they had to leave the dogs in there over the freezing night. Pallo returned the next morning, accompanied by a veterinary surgeon. They landed in the same clearing, found the capsule again, opened it, and to their amazement, Julka and Alpha were still alive. It was discovered by the 100 of physicians involved in the animal program that there were no major changes in the dogs' functions during their experiments, as long as they lived, of course. Following these launches, Korolyov's dream of sending a man in space began to take a certain shape. But before he could do that, he wanted to establish even more Soviet records in the space race. For that, he turned his attention to Earth's nearest neighbors, the Moon, Venus and Mars. Join me in the next episode to hear how the Soviets repeatedly managed to send spaceships to other planets at a time when most people in the Soviet Union barely had a radio. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.